In this lesson, we're going to learn how to work with Softimage ice dynamics and particles. So I've just opened up a blank scene here, and just so we can play with some pre-built dynamics, let's jump over to the Samples project. So I'm going to go to File, Open, and jump my paths down to the Samples project, and then let's jump into the Rendering folder, and I'm just going to grab the Ice Explosion file. You can grab any of these ice files, but I think this one looks particularly nice. So let's click Open, and what we're going to see is a particle simulation happening inside of our viewport here. Now at its base, Softimage's dynamic system is run through ICE, or the Interactive Creative Environment. Now this is a rather large part of Softimage, and it can get a little bit complex. So throughout this section of the course, we'll be covering some of the basics of ICE and creating particles with ICE. But before we go too deep into it, let's play around a little bit with this scene so we can see how particles are created and how dynamics work. So let's just rewind to the first frame and hit play. And we can see that these particles are being created inside of our viewer here. And we can jump from our wireframe down to our shaded mode, and these particles just look like simple spheres. So you might be thinking to yourself, okay, this doesn't look that great. What if we take a render region, just hold down Q and drag and draw it, we can see that the rendered result is incredibly different than what we see in the viewport. So this is essentially the first lesson of particles. What we see in the viewport is almost always a much simpler view and does not accurately convey what our final render will look like. That's because a big aspect of particles is actually inside of the rendering component. So with particles, we can create these very complex looking effects by using very simple objects like spheres. Now all of these particles are stored in a point cloud. We can see over here in our Explorer, this point cloud is called Explosion. Now let's take a look at the timeline and see what we can do here. We have to be careful because there are a few things we can do that will cause a strange reaction here in Softimage. Now whenever you need to reset a simulation, we always need to jump to the first frame of the animation. And that's because simulations are very time dependent. So if we start changing the time or editing the time in an awkward way, our simulation breaks. To see this, we can jump to the first frame and then left click anywhere on the timeline. We can see that it has to re-simulate all the way up to that point. Now we do get a particle simulation inside of our viewport, but as you can see, if you left click, we have a frozen simulation. And that's because for the most part, simulations only work forwards in time. We cannot really go backwards in time unless we use some techniques like caching or storing the particles in a different file. However, if we rewind and we hit play, we can see our particles animate and grow naturally. So this is the first thing. We almost never want to left click and jump to a certain part of our animation because the particles will not be simulated from the beginning, and we will in fact have a somewhat strange simulation. Now in the exact same way, we can't really left click and drag or jump to random parts of time because, as you can see, the simulation doesn't know what the current time is, or it doesn't know how to interpret these changing values. So for the most part, we just want to rewind and hit play. Now one last thing, the playback setting is very important. We want to make sure this is always set at playback all frames. Now if we're working in a simpler scene, this doesn't have as much of an effect, but if we open up a more complex scene and we have one of the real-time playback settings turned on, we can cause some errors and we can cause Softimage to jump frames. So for a simple scene like this, you can see that I get a very steady FPS. However, if you open up one of the more complex scenes like the fireworks scene, setting the playback on real time will have some pretty devastating effects, resulting in us skipping about 30 to 90 frames of our simulation. So again, when we're simulating, we want playback to be on play all frames. Now there might be a time when you need to pause the playback and you want to restart it or begin the playback from the current frame. And you can do this by middle clicking on the play icon. Normally if we hit the play icon, Softimage knows to reset the play head to the very beginning. However, again, sometimes we want to start from this frame, so we can middle click and it will begin simulating from this frame. Now, that doesn't mean we can jump backwards and middle click and it will re-simulate. If we ever need to reset a simulation, we always need to jump back to the first frame, either by left clicking on the play icon twice or just by jumping back to the first frame and then hitting play. So now that we know how to work a little bit more with particles, let's begin creating our own particle effect in the next lesson, where we'll take a look at creating an ice emitter and begin modifying it.